Jasmine Crockett, the relentless voice of justice versus Candace Owens, the provocateur of the right. In a nation on edge, two powerful voices met on a stage lit by tension and truth. Jasmine Crockett, a fearless defender of civil rights, stood across from Candace Owens, a conservative firebrand whose inflammatory rhetoric had ignited fierce division across the country. What began as a debate on racial justice swiftly unraveled into something far more explosive. When Owens delivered a shocking defense of nationalism, going so far as to invoke Hitler in a twisted justification of her views, the nation gasped. Millions watched in disbelief as her words sent tremors through the political landscape. And then, Jasmine Crockett struck. With unshakable resolve and righteous fury, she dismantled Owens's arguments piece by piece. Her voice, steady and sharp, cut through the noise like a blade of truth. She exposed Owens not just as misinformed, but as a willing agent of division, someone who profited off the pain of the very communities she claimed to represent. The lights dimmed. The air tightened. The battle had begun. Crockett and Owens stood as living embodiments of America's fractured soul, each at a podium, each carrying the weight of a movement. The debate, televised live, was more than a clash of ideas. It was a collision of worlds. Crockett, a rising Democratic star, had built her career confronting systemic injustice. Owens, the unapologetic conservative pundit, insisted that America's issues had nothing to do with race and everything to do with personal responsibility. As Owens dismissed Black Lives Matter as a money-making scheme built on division, the atmosphere grew tense. Her voice, calculated and cold, rang out. This isn't about justice, it's about profit. They exploit fear to keep the nation in chaos. The room fell into stunned silence. Then Crockett responded, not with outrage but with precision. Candace, what you just said isn't only reckless, it's dangerous. You're telling millions of Black Americans that their pain, their trauma, their lived reality is nothing but a scam. The weight of her words pressed into the room like gravity. You talk about exploitation, but let's be honest. It's people like you who twist truth for profit, who deny systemic oppression to fit a narrative, and who ignore the reality of a rigged system designed to hold us back. Crockett's voice rose, not in anger but in righteous defiance. You've never had to fight to exist in a world that sees you as less than. You've never walked in the shoes of someone who's been denied justice at every turn. The audience leaned in. Owens, unfazed, fired back with statistics and hardline rhetoric. Let's talk about real issues: crime, poverty, broken communities. These aren't caused by the system. They're the result of bad choices, not oppression. Her tone was clinical, confident, delivered with the sharpness of someone convinced of her own detachment from consequence. But Crockett wasn't done. She stepped forward, her voice a thunderclap of conviction. You throw out statistics like, they tell the whole story, but they don't. You refuse to ask why these numbers exist. What about the doors that were never opened? The wealth never allowed to be built? The opportunities stolen before they were ever offered? Her words hit with the force of centuries of injustice. You say poverty is a choice, but you ignore the system that has spent generations ensuring those choices were never real to begin with. Redlining, unequal schools, voter suppression, mass incarceration. These aren't myths, Candace, they're lived realities. Silence fell. A silence full of realization, reflection, reckoning. Crockett looked Owens square in the eyes and delivered the final blow. You want to talk about crime? Let's talk about the crimes of the system, the ones that built this country on the backs of those it now leaves behind. The verdict was clear. This was more than a debate. It was a reckoning, a moment when truth was laid bare, and the crowd, and the country, had to choose a side. Would they cling to denial and division, or would they stand with those fighting for justice, equality, and a future where every voice is heard? Stay with us. This is the story of America's crossroads, and it's only just begun. Crockett's voice, steady yet impassioned, cut through the noise. Black Lives Matter. That's not the problem. The problem is people like you who refuse to even see the problem. You refuse to acknowledge the lives lost, the families shattered, the communities gutted. You refuse to see the long shadow of systemic racism still cast over every institution in this country. Her tone softened, but her words hit harder. Until you face that truth, until you understand what's really happening in this country, you will never be part of the solution. You will always be part of the problem. A hush fell over the room. The audience, once divided, now sat united in silence, their eyes locked on Crockett. Across from her, Owens stood frozen, her trademark composure giving way to something unfamiliar. Doubt. For the first time in the debate, she looked shaken. Then a low hum broke the tension. All eyes turned to the screen behind the stage. A video began to play. It was dated 2018. Owens appeared at a Turning Point USA event, her voice unmistakably clear. Nationalism, that's what we need. Hitler was a nationalist, and if we're being honest, his methods were just misunderstood. The words landed like a thunderclap. Gasps rippled through the audience. Faces morphed from curiosity to horror. It wasn't a slip of the tongue. It was a declaration. Owens had aligned herself, willingly or not, with one of history's darkest figures. She stood in place, her expression unreadable as the clip echoed across the room. The internet responded instantly. Candace Owens exposed trended globally within minutes. Even her conservative allies recoiled. I can't believe I ever supported her. Nationalism doesn't mean this. She's gone too far. This isn't patriotism. This is poison. The conservative movement that once hailed Owens as a rising star now scrambled to distance themselves. Crockett stepped forward. Calm, resolute. What you just saw isn't out of context. It's the truth. She's not a defender of freedom. She's not a voice of reason. She's an apologist for dangerous ideologies, for hate, for division, for the darkest parts of our past. Owens shifted, visibly uncomfortable. Crockett didn't relent. You talk about unity, Candace, but it's people like you who build the walls. You use your platform to divide, to spread fear dressed as patriotism. And now you want to pretend you were misunderstood? She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. You praised a man responsible for genocide. You linked yourself to an ideology that destroyed millions. And now, when faced with the consequences, you want to hide? The room was silent. An electric, oppressive silence. You've made a career out of exploiting pain, out of giving comfort to the powerful while the rest of us bleed. You don't get to walk that back. Owens tried to interject, but the cracks in her armor were too wide now. Her silence said more than any rebuttal could. Crockett delivered the final blow. You can't rewrite history. You can't undo the damage. The world has seen who you are, and we will not forget. Around them, the crowd stirred, some nodding solemnly, others stunned into reflection. The debate had ceased to be political. It had become something deeper, a reckoning. And Owens, once so confident, now stood alone, at the center of a storm she could no longer control. Crockett stood unwavering, her conviction unshaken by Owens's incendiary rhetoric. She refused to let it go unchallenged. Across from her, Owens' composure visibly faltered. The confident facade she wore just moments ago crumbled, replaced by the unmistakable weight of panic. For once, Candace Owens had no words. It was no longer just political theater. This was exposure. The truth had stepped into the light. The room held its breath. Silence fell, thick and electric. The debate was over, but the impact had only just begun. Within minutes, the internet ignited. Social media feeds erupted with clips of the exchange. Headlines followed fast. Candace Owens under fire for nationalism and Hitler remarks. The footage, pulled from a years-old interview, circulated like wildfire. In it, Owens appeared to justify nationalism and reference Hitler in terms far too lenient for comfort. The backlash was swift and merciless. This wasn't just a progressive outcry. Conservatives, too, began to distance themselves. Influencers once loyal to Owens tweeted condemnations. This isn't what we stand for. Another added, this rhetoric has no place in patriotic discourse. Hashtags like "Duan Owens exposed" and "Shame on Candace" surged across platforms. The storm had begun. Jasmine Crockett, unwilling to let Owens slip into damage control, took the offensive. She flooded the media and social feeds with a clear, searing narrative. "What you witnessed tonight," Crockett tweeted in a post that quickly went viral, "is a woman who has spent years denying systemic racism, only to align herself with the very ideologies that built it. This isn't about free speech. This is about dangerous lies." Crockett wasn't content with symbolic victory. She followed through, press appearances, interviews, and posts, dismantling Owens's defense piece by piece. "This wasn't a slip of the tongue," she said on national television. "It's a pattern. Owens has built a career on minimizing the Black experience. Now she's defending nationalism as if history hasn't taught us the cost." She laid it bare. Owens's rhetoric was an attempt to repackage oppression as patriotism, to sanitize extremism for mainstream consumption. The media, once a platform for Owens, now turned to Crockett as the voice of accountability. As Owens scrambled to regain control, she stepped back into the spotlight with sharpened claws. "What you're doing here is manipulation," Owens snapped, leaning into the microphone. "You're turning racial inequality into a political weapon for your own gain. That's what's disgusting." But the words rang hollow. Her attack felt desperate, a deflection, not a defense. Crockett didn't flinch. "You want to talk about manipulation?" Crockett's voice was cool but firm. "You've spent years selling people a lie, that racism is dead, that the system isn't broken, and you're doing it not for truth but for profit." The audience, once tense, shifted. A tide was turning. Crockett pressed harder. "You preach personal responsibility like it's a cure-all, ignoring the system rigged against us. You say Black people should pull themselves up, but you've never had to live with the fear of being denied a job, a home, or even your life because of your skin. That's not truth, Candace, that's privilege weaponized." Owens tried to interject. "That's not what I said. It's exactly what you implied," Crockett fired back. "And implication matters. Influence matters. You've used your platform to gaslight a generation into thinking their pain is fiction, that their struggle is just an excuse. You aren't helping Black America. You're selling it out." The room was no longer split. There was no doubt. Who had taken the moral ground? Crockett spoke for more than herself. She gave voice to millions whose experiences had been minimized, ignored, or dismissed. "This isn't about politics anymore," she said. "It's about who we are as a country. You either confront the truth or you become complicit in the lie." Owens had no comeback. The momentum had shifted, the damage irreparable. Her words had been her undoing, and Jasmine Crockett, she had become more than a voice. She was the reckoning. "You're the one doing the manipulating here, Crockett," Candace said steadily. "You're twisting the truth to fit a narrative that divides instead of heals." The audience, momentarily stunned, began to stir. Applause didn't erupt like before, but murmurs of agreement rippled through those who were still listening with open minds. For every person who nodded at Crockett's words, there was another who saw Owens not as a villain, but as someone brave enough to question the dominant script. Crockett's statements played well for the cameras, but they weren't revelations. They were rehearsed condemnations meant to trigger outrage, not reflection. Candace didn't flounder. She stood firm in her convictions while the media machinery turned a misrepresented quote into a symbol of evil. Her defenses didn't crumble. They were simply ignored by those who had already decided the verdict. The intensity in the room wasn't truth breaking through. It was a crowd swept up in the performance of moral righteousness. The so-called fallout was nothing more than a manufactured scandal. The kind of scandal that rewards outrage, not understanding. The clip that went viral wasn't evidence of extremism. It was evidence of selective editing, of an audience conditioned to hear only what it's told to be offended by. The reaction wasn't organic. It was orchestrated. Media outlets that once championed her pulled back, not because of any real danger in her words, but because of fear. fear of being next in the line of fire from a mob that tolerates no dissent from its orthodoxy. Candace's social media became a target, not because she betrayed any principle, but because she upheld one too unpopular in a moment of cultural hysteria. Hashtags trended not because the country was unified in condemnation, but because outrage is algorithmically rewarded. Allies who distanced themselves weren't disillusioned. They were afraid. They didn't disown her ideas. They ran from the cost of defending them. The conservative movement, in trying to placate critics, lost one of its boldest voices. But Candace hadn't changed. Only the willingness of others to stand with her had. She was labeled dangerous, not because she was wrong, but because she was effective. The outrage she faced came not from any real endorsement of hate, but because she dared to say the system isn't broken, it's being manipulated. And that's a threat to those who thrive in division. Behind the scenes, institutions that once benefited from her influence folded to pressure. Contracts disappeared, engagements canceled, not because of what she said, but because of how it was framed. She was sacrificed not to preserve truth, but to protect reputations. She wasn't the architect of division. She was the mirror held up to it. The real danger wasn't her words. It was how quickly the truth could be twisted into a weapon against her. Candace Owens built her platform by challenging groupthink, by speaking to millions who felt unseen in mainstream narratives. Her refusal to soften her views in the face of criticism wasn't arrogance, it was integrity. What happened in the aftermath of that debate wasn't a reckoning, it was a warning. Tell the wrong truth and you'll be erased. But the public isn't as blind as her critics hoped. Many still saw her clearly. The debate didn't end her story. It simply revealed how fragile the illusion of consensus really is. Crockett's performance may have won the applause that night, but it didn't change the facts. The system isn't broken. It's being bent by those who benefit from keeping people convinced it can't be fixed. Candace Owens stood against that, and for many, that's exactly why she's still worth listening to. The debate had done something to Jasmine Crockett, something irreversible. It stirred something deep within her, something fierce and unstoppable. What had unfolded on that stage wasn't just a clash of ideologies, it was an awakening. The backlash against Candace Owens wasn't merely a personal win, it was a vindication of everything Crockett had fought for. Every marginalized voice, every community silenced or ignored had been heard in that moment, and Crockett had become their mouthpiece, their advocate, their champion. The momentum had shifted. The fight was far from over, but now the tide was turning. For the first time, her message wasn't being pushed to the sidelines, it was front and center. The debate had peeled back the layers of polite discourse to expose a stark and painful truth. The divide in America was real, and it was widening, and it was. On one side stood Crockett, demanding justice and equality. On the other, Owens, clinging to a version of nationalism that denied the very real suffering of millions. The contrast was undeniable. Crockett represented a path forward, a vision, rooted in healing, in reckoning, in honesty. Owens symbolized a refusal to let go of the lie that America had already solved its deepest problems. As the media frenzy continued, Crockett's influence exploded. She was invited to speak across the country, rallies, interviews, forums. Her words reached further than ever, striking chords with people who had long felt unseen. Within the Democratic Party, long plagued by division and indecision, a new voice had emerged. A voice that was clear, fearless, and unshakable. Crockett wasn't just talking policy. She was articulating a future, one where opportunity didn't depend on race or circumstance, one where justice wasn't theoretical but lived and enforced. Her story began to shift. No longer seen as a background figure or a political firebrand, she had become the nucleus of a movement, one that wasn't just reactive, but visionary. She had confronted the status quo head-on, dragged long-ignored truths into the light, and people noticed. Even some of those who had once dismissed her were forced to reckon with her presence. She was no longer just a voice. She was a force. Still, Crockett understood the weight of this moment. It wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The forces she had called out, the systemic racism, the institutional denial, the machinery of division were not going to vanish. They would push back harder than ever. But now she had the upper hand. The narrative had changed. The silence had been broken. The real battle was just beginning. What lay ahead would require more than powerful speeches or viral moments. It would take organizing, endurance, and a kind of leadership unafraid of losing comfort in the pursuit of change. But for the first time, Crockett was sure. She was ready. She had shown that the truth could no longer be contained, that no amount of power or money could erase the lived reality of Black Americans. The stage where she had faced Candace Owens had become more than a platform. It had become a crucible. It exposed not just Owens's ideological fragility, but the desperation of an entire political machine clinging to narratives that no longer held. As Crockett stood there, the room still electric from what had just unfolded, she felt the weight of history pressing against her shoulders. But she didn't shrink. Her posture was steady, her voice calm, her purpose absolute. Owens, once so confident, had faltered, not because she had been attacked, but because the mirror of truth had been held up and what stared back was indefensible. Still, Crockett didn't gloat. This wasn't about humiliation. This was about transformation. The words that Owens had spoken would continue to echo, but now they would do so in a different light. They had been revealed for what they were, tools of denial, of erasure, of control. Crockett understood the danger hadn't passed. A single debate didn't dismantle the pillars of systemic oppression. The forces she was up against were entrenched, powerful, and determined to endure. But she had seen something else. That night, the crowd shifting, the silence breaking, the truth getting louder. She drew a breath and addressed the room again, her voice carrying the weight of a generation's hope. "This isn't about me," she said. "And it's not just about Candace Owens. It's about every single person who has ever been told that their life doesn't matter. Every Black American who has had to fight not just for a seat at the table, but for their very right to exist." Her voice grew stronger. "The forces that divide us have been working for generations to keep us silent. But I'm here to say, this is our moment. This is the moment we say no more. We will not let justice be delayed, truth be buried, or our voices be erased. We are not going back." Applause thundered through the room, but Crockett remained focused. She knew cheers were easy. Change was hard. This wasn't about a soundbite or a trending moment. This was the beginning of something far bigger. A movement. One that would require more than her alone. One that demanded the courage of millions. She had no illusions. She had seen the system, how it twists, fights, and retaliates. But she had also seen resistance. She had seen what happens when people stop waiting and start acting. She had seen the spark, and she would not let it die. The confrontation with Owens had become something more than just political theater. It was a turning point, a reminder that the future wouldn't be handed over. It had to be seized. And Jasmine Crockett had just shown the world that she was ready. Crockett stepped off the stage, the magnitude of the moment pressing into her shoulders. She had won tonight, but this was not the end. It was merely the beginning. With every stride, her resolve deepened. The truth had broken through the noise, and she was determined to ensure it would never be silenced again, no matter how loud the opposition grew. The world had just witnessed what could happen when one voice refused to back down. Now it was time to see what could be built when millions rose with that same courage. For Jasmine Crockett, this wasn't just a personal triumph. It was the spark of a movement, one that could shift the course of history. The forces of extremism and division had been dragged into the light. Now, the forces of justice and truth had a chance to rise. As the dust of the confrontation settled, a quiet realization came over her. This fight had never been about a single debate. It was about something deeper, something more enduring. It was about truth, about justice, about the very meaning of standing tall when everything around you tries to make you kneel. She hadn't fought just for herself. She had spoken for every voice that had been drowned out, for every life overlooked or dismissed. Her words had pierced through the lies, the twisted narratives, the sanitized history, the comfortable denial. But the cost of that truth-telling had been heavy. The insults, the attacks, the attempts to reduce her to a caricature, angry, radical, divisive, had weighed on her shoulders alone. She had been told to sit down, to be quiet, to make peace with injustice. Instead, she chose to rise and speak. In that moment, Crockett understood a fundamental truth. The greatest battles are not won with sharp tongues or clenched fists alone. They are won with the courage to speak when silence would be easier. They are won by those who dare to pull the curtain back, even when the truth is painful, especially then. The truth, she realized, was the most dangerous weapon of all. And she had chosen to wield it without apology. But this wasn't the end of the road, not even close. Every victory would give way to another challenge. The voices of hate, the systems of inequality, the deeply rooted forces of division. They wouldn't vanish overnight. They were part of the very fabric she was trying to unravel. And that was the hard truth Crockett faced. Her triumph over Owens, as significant as it was only a single moment in a much longer war. Real change doesn't come from one clash. It comes from persistence, from an unbreakable will to keep going long after the cameras stop rolling. She had learned that the path to justice isn't linear. It is littered with setbacks, clouded by doubt and tested by fatigue. But it is also lit by moments of defiance, by breakthroughs of clarity, by flashes of a future worth fighting for. Standing there, her voice still echoing in the minds of millions, Crockett knew the journey ahead would be long, but she also knew why she had to walk it. There were more people to fight for, more lies to dismantle, more systems to confront. Because this wasn't just about politics. It was about the soul of a nation. It was about what it truly means to be free, to be equal, to be seen. And in that final realization, the lesson crystallized. When you fight for justice, you do so not for applause, not for the spotlight, but because the fight itself is the only way forward. The world may try to silence the truth, but the truth once spoken cannot be buried, and once it rises, nothing can ever be the same again. The battle won't be easy, but the victory of truth, when it comes, will be worth every sacrifice. And so the journey continues. As long as injustice remains, there will always be a need for warriors like Jasmine Crockett, ready to rise, ready to fight, ready to speak the truth, no matter the cost. Thank you for watching and standing with us on this journey. Your support matters. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what comes next. Share your thoughts in the comments. What moment moved you most?